y'all. Good evening, everyone. My name is Abeyo Chimika Tisdale. I'm the programming assistant at Charis Books and More, which is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Tonight, we are so excited to be joined by Dr. Keisha Blain in celebration of Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights. This book is a much-needed account of Black women's aspirations, strategies, and struggles to pioneer a human rights approach to combating systems of injustice. Tonight, Dr. Blain will be in conversation with Beverly Guy-Sheftall, who is the founding director of the Women's Research and Resource Center and Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College. She has published a number of texts within African American and women's studies, which have been noted as seminal works by other scholars, including Words of Fire, Gender Talk, I Am Your Sister, collected and unpublished writings of Audre Lorde, to name a few. Most recently, she is the author of Black Feminist Free, which came out last November, and is a collection of her essays, public speeches, and interviews. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheftall. Keisha Blain is a professor of Africana Studies and History at Brown University. She is a Guggenheim, Carnegie, and New America Fellow, and is the author of numerous books, including the National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America. She lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Blain. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. There's going to be about 45 minutes of conversation and then 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions. When we get to that portion of the evening, you can just step up to the mic over there and ask your questions to either one of them. And buying your book directly from Charis really supports us in putting on free events like this. So right outside the auditorium to your right, we are selling books, so make sure to grab your copy for Dr. Blain to sign after the event. Thanks so much, y'all.
Start by saying I have been supporting Charis and going to Charis since it started, in whatever year it started. I can't remember. And when did Charis start?
1970.
Okay, so I've been going since then, and I still go and love independent feminist bookstores. So I've already told.
Microphone. Can't hear.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I love this book.
Thank you.
And let me just say, I thought I knew a lot of Black women's history. I do know a lot of Black women's history. However, I learned a lot in this book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights. And you will see why. So I just want to thank you for filling all of the gaps in Black women's history, going back to certainly Maria Stewart in 1832, but even before 1832. And so I want to ask her to start by putting Without Fear into the context of her other books. And I don't know if you read, yeah, because it's on. Hello? Is that better or no? Okay, so I don't know why. So, 3, 4, 5, 8 books.
No, ma'am.
Testing.
They're both going in and out.
Because it's on.
It's a buzzing noise, plus you have to put it to your mouth.
Hello? It's working. Is yours in and out too?
I think so.
Yeah, yours in and out too. I can talk loud. Okay. Should we wait?
Yes, please. Is this one working?
Yes.
Okay.
There we go. We're all caught with
Is this, yeah, this is better. Okay.
Yeah.
So, 4 of your books. I had not read the other 4, which I had ordered already, but would you please put this most recent book within the context of your amazing historical texts?
Yes, certainly.
Okay.
We'll make it work. Well, first and foremost, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. It truly is wonderful to be in Atlanta today, and thank you so much, Professor Guy-Sheftall, for agreeing to do this. Where to begin? I have been thinking about Black women's history for a very long time. I have been, of course, writing about Black women's history now for about 10 years, and that's not necessarily as long as you have been doing this work, but in that time, what I've tried to do is really center the voices and experiences of Black women who are often falling through the cracks of both US and global history. The first book that I published in 2018 is entitled Set the World on Fire, and that book is based on my doctoral dissertation, in which I was really grappling with explaining how Black women shaped Black nationalist politics in the US and across the diaspora. I was frustrated with the way that people spoke about Black nationalism as somehow disappearing following the arrest and deportation of Marcus Garvey, and then somehow reappearing with the Black Power movement, and it just didn't make sense to me. I also couldn't understand why these narratives were still so male-dominated when we know that women played such a crucial role in these groups. And it's not just simply that they played a crucial role, they made up a significant portion of the membership. For many of these organizations, they represented the majority, in fact. And so I had a lot of questions at the time, and Set the World on Fire allowed me to answer those questions. And what I demonstrated in that book is that if we look at Black women's political activism, we actually see a different timeline for Black nationalist politics. We see that women were the ones who pretty much picked up the mantle when Garvey was deported. It wasn't simply that the movement died, it's that people stopped paying attention because women were the ones who were at the forefront of the movement. They created their own organizations. I talk about a woman by the name of Minnie Maudlina Gordon, who establishes the largest Black nationalist organization founded by a woman in the United States, and most people had not even heard of her. And so that was truly an act of historical recovery, and I definitely think it helped to shape multiple conversations. Many people have referenced the book as really, I think, reorienting their understanding of Black nationalist politics, of Black internationalist politics, of Black women's political activism. And from there, I wanted to do a number of things. What's interesting is I started writing a book on Afro-Asia that came out of Set the World on Fire because I was so intrigued with the fact that so many Black women were deeply invested in forging transnational solidarities, and particularly with people of Asian descent, and even more specifically, they were fascinated with Japan. And that's both intriguing and complicated, as I'm sure you understand. And I wanted to write a book to explain this, to demonstrate how Black women engaged Japan, primarily in the 20th century. I started writing it. I wrote 2 chapters of the book. I had plans to travel to Japan for research, and this is 2020. And as you know, with the pandemic, all of my plans fell to the wayside. And at the time I was in the process of writing about Hamer. I would write these short pieces. I published several articles on Fannie Lou Hamer. And I published this short piece in Time magazine on Hamer and received so much feedback. So many people emailed me and said, I've never heard of this woman. I thought, really? How could you never heard of Fannie Lou Hamer? What are you saying? But people were saying, I hadn't heard of her, I didn't know this. I love how you explain her relevance. I wish you would write more. I was intrigued by that. And then I was also really thinking about the moment we were living in. It wasn't just COVID, but it was also, as you all know, in so many ways, the height of Black Lives Matter as a movement. And I saw the way that Black Lives Matter activists were really drawing inspiration from Fannie Lou Hamer's ideas and political activism. So long story short, in the midst of the pandemic, I sat down and wrote a book on Fannie Lou Hamer. I had not planned to do so, but I did, and that came out 2021 actually, so it was a rapid process. But when you're home and you can't do anything else, actually, you tend to write a lot. And so that was my second book. But as I was writing this book on Fannie Lou Hamer, I was thinking a lot about civil rights, thinking a lot about the struggle for citizenship rights in the US. And I was struck by a statement that Fannie Lou Hamer articulated, in which she said, "I'm no longer fighting for equal rights, I'm fighting for human rights." And she would repeat this in different contexts, and I started thinking, what does she mean exactly? What exactly is happening? What is this ideological shift as she lays it out? And as I started asking those questions, I realized, okay, the way to answer this question is, in fact, to write a book on Black women and human rights, to go back from the very beginning. I thought I would start with emancipation. Turns out, as you said, I had to go back to the 1830s, and turns out I had to go back even further to explain how Black women conceptualize human rights. And what I found is something truly remarkable, that they thought deeply about human rights, they thought about human rights, they worked to shape human rights activism, even though they were not even recognized as citizens of the United States. So I think all of that is to say, and of course I've written other things in between, but I won't, I've done other collaborative projects. In the end, I see my books as truly, I think, answers to many questions that I have. And I'll admit I tend to write multiple things at once, and so now I have 3 different projects brewing, but it's mostly because I recognize that each book will do something different, and one book cannot possibly do everything you want it to do. And I know there are a lot of, there's a lot of pressure, especially in the academy, to publish or perish, and there's so much that we're dealing with. But my sense is that when we start a project, we have to be clear about the questions we're asking and the answers that we are ultimately providing. And sometimes I think it'll take 4 or 5 books to actually answer fully. And so I see my work in that light, and so I think about how projects can help to broaden conversations in different directions. And so that's really, I think, the best way to situate Without Fear when connected to my book on Hamer, but also my earlier book, Set the World on Fire.
So if the audience probably wants to know, as do I, how do you explain Black women's interest in Asia, particularly Japan? And it weaves through this book too. So tell us what you,
Yes.
okay, and whether that was peculiar to Black women as opposed to Black men.
Wow, where to begin? What I will say is that when we think about Black intellectual history in the broad sense, we certainly do see the way that Japan figures prominently, and I've written a little bit about this. We see even someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, who thought about Japan, in a very favorable light. For some activists, it was about seeing Japan as an ally in the struggle to defeat global white supremacy, to see them as capable allies. We think about, for example, Japan's ability to defeat Russia, 1904, 1905, a pivotal moment that some Black activists point to as, here's the evidence that this nation has the capacity to defeat white supremacy, right? So that it was symbolic, it was certainly a real moment in history, but many activists took away from it the symbolism of it all. The other thing too is that, and I talk about this in different contexts, a number of Japanese activists and intellectuals, they were very active at the grassroots level in convincing African Americans that they are in fact allies and they could be allies in the struggle. We see that even in the context of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, a Black nationalist organization in which there would be a number of Japanese intellectuals coming to meetings, collaborating, talking to people, making a case for Japan. We see that, of course, I mentioned Lena Gordon as an example. We see that in Chicago. One of the reasons that she's interested in Japan is because she meets someone who, at least, and it's a complicated story, but he presents himself as a Japanese activist. Turns out he was Filipino, but nonetheless, she believed him, believed who he said he was. And he was making a case that one of the things that Black people needed to do was they needed to forge these connections externally because they needed to bolster their political power. Obviously, I mentioned the complexities of it because Japan, certainly imperialistic, certainly we know invading Manchuria as an example, as just one of the many examples of Japan actually doing everything that Black nationalists and other activists are condemning. But for some Black intellectuals, and I'll say radical intellectuals in particular, it made sense to have this alliance. The other thing too that I would emphasize is the Paris Peace Conference as another moment of solidarity. It comes up, as you know, in Without Fear. I actually talk about Madam C.J. Walker. Madam C.J. Walker, who plays this pivotal role in the establishment of this organization called the International League for Darker Peoples in 1919. And the purpose of the organization, among many of their goals, is to make an appeal through the Japanese delegates to make an appeal for racial equality. So long story short, so Black activists at the time don't actually have a seat at the table at the Paris Peace Conference, and so the idea is that they would rely on Japanese delegates as proxy to be able to push forward these ideas. And the Japanese delegation actually said, they say, yes, we'll do it. We will, in fact, advocate for racial equality. They're not successful. They certainly make the case. It's not successful at the time, but what I argue in the book is we see how someone like Madam C.J. Walker plays this pivotal role. She literally organizes the meeting between the delegates and several activists, and she uses her influence to make that possible. And once again, it's about seeing Japan as a potential ally in order to defeat global white supremacy and in order to advance the cause of Black liberation. So there are a number of reasons why people turn to Japan, both in terms of militaristic motivations, but also symbolism, also certain historical developments that people hold on to. And quite frankly, there's propaganda too, right? That's happening that some people really do believe and accept. But as you can imagine, it leads to a number of complexities, and it doesn't go well for many of these activists who, not surprisingly, find themselves in prison for collaborating with Japanese intellectuals and activists leading up to World War II.
We tend to talk more about civil rights than human rights, so will you share what your concept of human rights is, and also talk about why you think Black women have been left out of the very important narrative about human rights? And the travel, I mean, you got the travel that these Black women did all over the world. I don't know, they didn't have credit cards, they didn't have cell phones. It is amazing. And so would you talk a little bit about how they managed to be all over the world?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that last question is a question that I'm trying to answer in another book project. So I've been slowly working on this project that will take some time. I'm trying to capture this long sweeping history of Black women's international travel to explain exactly that. And it is difficult, but I think an important narrative to tell. Where to begin? What's interesting is that within the context of US history, certainly, much of our conversation around rights has been through the lens of citizenship rights, which is not all that surprising when you think about the experience of Black people in this country. You think about slavery, you think about emancipation, and the goal is very, I think quite frankly, immediately at 1865, the goal is to demonstrate broadly that in fact Black people are members of the national polity, that they should have rights, that they should have certain kinds of access because of their status as citizens of the United States. Obviously, not everyone agrees with this. People push back. We know the story of Reconstruction. I don't have to tell you this. But what's interesting is that because we focus so much on the struggle for civil rights, we've lost sight of how Black women activists in particular spent a lot of time strategizing and thinking far beyond the borders of the United States. So why human rights? Well, what Black women realized was that they could find themselves constantly making a case, trying to appeal to Americans and saying, listen, we should be given protections and rights based on the Constitution. We can go back and forth and say, yes, you may not have conceptualized, you may not have seen or imagined us as part of this vision, but we are part of this vision. And you can go back and forth pushing people to live up to the ideals of the Constitution. That's certainly one strategy, but many of these women came to the realization that actually that's not even the argument to make. The argument to make is that the rights we're seeking aren't solely rights because they are protected or granted by the Constitution or because we are citizens of the United States. We're asking for rights that are due to us simply because we are human. And when you make that case, you shift you shift the focus and you elevate the conversation and you actually make it harder for people to deny you those rights. So now it's not quibbling about, well, what did the Constitution actually mean? Who was included when we said, that you can have these protections? Did you have property? Did you not have property? As we know, right, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, Reconstruction Amendments certainly opened up opportunities for Black men, not for Black women. So there's all of these complexities, and Black women are very much attentive to this, but they're saying it's bigger than this. We have rights and we have protections that are actually given by God. These are divinely inspired, and they should apply to every single breathing human, regardless of where they live, regardless of what they look like, regardless of their sexuality, regardless of their religion, and they recognize that by reframing the conversation, it would not only help to shame the United States on a global scale to say, listen, you are not only denying us rights as citizens, you're in fact denying us basic rights that we should have as humans. So shame on you, and that's Ida B. Wells literally saying shame on the United States for that. But the other thing about framing it this way is it opens up the door for transnational solidarities and networks. And it provides a space for Black women to forge all of these alliances, which, to the second part of your question, makes it possible to travel extensively. Even in the case of Ida B. Wells, she's able to raise funds to travel. Much of the support that she has to travel when she goes to the UK in the 1890s is through these networks and collaborations that she's established transnationally. So it's not just about friendships or political allies, but people who are at times willing to pool resources to make it possible for Black women to cross borders physically. And then there are times Black women are just creative too. I talk in the book about someone, Pearl Sherrod, who's this working class activist in Detroit, who doesn't have the means to travel widely, but she's able to go from Detroit to Vancouver in 1937, and she does that. And she shows up at this conference where Asian women are gathering with white women to talk about rights and freedom, and yet they had not invited Black women. So she crashes the party. She was like, let's be clear, none of this matters if you don't pay attention to Black women. It's a powerful moment, and she's able to do that because she physically crosses borders, and that's only possible through the grassroots support that she's getting from Detroit, through various groups that she's a part of, but particularly a radical group called the Development of Our Own. So very diverse means, I think, we see diverse strategies that Black women are employing, and we see the power of international travel at the grassroots, at the national. It simply opens up a world of possibility for these women And then of course there are people like Mary McLeod Bethune, who by the 1940s, she is everywhere, truly everywhere, and she recognizes just the power of travel for Black women's not only national political activism, but global activism.
No, I don't know whether this has been your experience, but in the so-called academic feminism of the last 5 or 10 years, there's this so-called new field called transnational feminisms, which leaves us out.
Yes.
And I have had serious conversations, even with some of my friends, about the fact that Black women have been involved in transnational feminisms and activisms going back to the 19th century. So I've been telling them about your book. I mean, it needs to change the entire argument about transnational feminisms being primarily U.S. white women in solidarity with women in other parts, and we're not in that discourse. So has that been your experience?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, just last semester I taught a course, Black Transnational Feminism, and that was a powerful experience because many of the students in that course had taken an array of courses on feminism, on transnationalism, and I was struck by the fact that they had not encountered any of the women who I spoke about. In fact, I assigned Set the World on Fire, and one of the conversations we had in the class, the students said to me, you know, this is fascinating. You're talking about women from the 1920s thinking about feminist politics transnationally. Like, I didn't even know Black women were doing this in the 20s. And I'm like, well, really? That's 20s. We can go back to the 19th century, actually. So to your point, I find that these narratives are truly, truly absent. And you know, as I've been talking and just thinking about even human rights, when I say to students, when you think about the establishment of the United Nations, the actual establishment of the United Nations, San Francisco, 1945, you cannot think about that history without Black women, and particularly the work of Mary McLeod Bethune. Many students don't even know that she was there. And it's important to center her voice. Not only was she there, she was advocating powerfully for Black people. She was making a case that in drafting the charter for the United Nations, there needed to be a focus on colonialism, making an argument that a lot of people simply didn't want to hear at the time. They wanted to talk about human rights in these grand ways, but they didn't want to deal with the very real conditions of Black people across the diaspora. They didn't want to grapple with colonialism on the African continent, for example. And Mary McLeod Bethune pushed and did so even despite a lot of resistance from people. She did that work. So why is it that when we talk about the United Nations, that we don't think about her contributions? Why are we still telling this male-dominated, certainly, but also a whitewashed version of the history? In Without Fear, I talk about Black women at the United Nations, 45, 46, 47, 48. A lot of people don't even realize this. That yes, it is true that we were shut out of many of these spaces, but if you know your history, you know that Black women didn't sit around waiting for people to open a door, didn't wait for someone to say, welcome to the table. Are you kidding me? No. And so this history is one in which I'm showing people, Black women in particular, have been at the forefront, and they've been utilizing an array of tactics and strategies and relying on various organizations. I talk about Black sororities as these vital spaces in which to engage in human rights activism, because it's one of the spaces that were available for Black women. But many people don't pay attention to that history, so they're only telling a particular kind of story. So it is truly, I think, surprising. It was surprising to me. As I was writing the book, I remember thinking, this can't be possible. Like, I'm doing research, I have research assistants, and I'm like, make me a list of books on Black women and human rights, and they're like, here's one thing. I'm like, no, there has to be more. And to my surprise, there wasn't that much. because sadly, even the literature on human rights has erased us. Some of the biggest, most prominent, well-known works on human rights history don't even mention Ida B. Wells. How is that possible? But it is the case. And so imagine then how we are teaching this history. So I certainly hope that this book will force people to change the conversation, tell a more accurate portrayal of this history. And the other thing too is, I made a point earlier about knowing that every book can't accomplish everything. I know that the book can't accomplish everything, but my hope is that it will inspire other people to pick up the pieces. And I think I've done my best to provide breadcrumbs, so to speak, so that other researchers, other grad students, others who are thinking about projects can find in this book a number of directions in which to follow, in which to build on this work, and even expand it further in directions I've never even imagined. So I certainly hope it will do that.
You know, I want you to talk a little bit about, in addition to names that we know, Mayor Church-Terrell, you know, all of those folk. I want you to mention just maybe a couple of Black women's names that we never heard of. But one of the things that was amazing to me was Lena Horne. Always think, you know, you grew up and you hear about how beautiful Lena Horne is. So would you tell us a little bit of Lena Horne's story, which was amazing to me.
Yes, so many remarkable women. And I will say, what's interesting about Lena Horne, I had initially had no plans to write about her. I had, of course, drafted my book proposal. I had a list of women I wanted to write about. I had already gathered some material. But then I just kept bumping up against Lena Horne. I was like, I would be looking for someone else, and then I would find an article from her, and that's when I realized that she had a column in the 1940s. She was writing in the people's voice. She was writing about human rights. I couldn't believe it. Because to your point, I had only thought of her as an entertainer, and I think so. For so many of us, we have this very limited view of people, and I didn't even recognize her full complexity. That she not only thought deeply about human rights, that she spoke about human rights, and finding her column meant also then finding her speeches. She would travel extensively, just given the line of work she was in, and she would draw comparisons between what she was seeing abroad and what she was seeing in the United States. And then she condemned Jim Crow, not solely because, to the earlier point I was making, because it violated citizenship rights within the context of US, but she was able to talk about Jim Crow and draw the connections to imperialism, draw the connections to fascism, to show that this is in fact part and parcel of a larger system of oppression that's not only hurting Black people in the United States, but other people of color globally. And so she was a very thoughtful, intellectual who wrote about these things. And one of the things I point out in the book too is that if you only pay attention to her performances or even songs, you would miss this. You would miss this entirely, because she, I think, was astute enough to recognize that she couldn't necessarily talk about everything in every particular venue. That's the other thing too about these women. Very strategic, very careful. We live in a moment where I think there's this impulse to put everything out there all the time in every particular space. And what I saw was just a carefulness with her. So behind the scenes, she was advocating for equal rights. She was challenging studios, and she was advocating for herself and for others. She was talking about these concerns. She was putting her money where her political commitments were. So we see all of these things taking place. And that meant that she could be quite effective, but it also meant that from the outside looking in, many people missed it. But even to this point, I was thinking about just the power of Black women's activism. We talk about the invisibility of it all at times in the history, but I see that as a powerful strategy too. What do I mean? I was thinking just now as we're talking about Pearl Sherrod, who I mentioned, who's this working class activist. When the FBI decides that they're going to track down these radical activists who are interested in Japan and causing too much trouble. They set out to squash these movements, but they're looking for men. So they're arresting men, right? They're making all these moves. And at one point they show up at Pearl Sherrod's apartment, and they literally documented like nothing's happening here, just a dinner party. They didn't know that dinner party was more than just a dinner party, right? And I chuckled about that, but that's a powerful thing because it meant that because of her invisibility to them, she was able to keep the movement going in this very fascinating way. And so I see Lena Horne as part of this genealogy of people who are very clear about what needs to happen, and they utilize a range of strategies in which to assert their political power, in which to bring about change, and it's easy to miss it if you're not looking carefully. And so to the other question about other women, I'll mention one in particular, which actually connects to this theme of invisibility, and that is a woman by the name of Marguerite Cartwright. I talk about Marguerite Cartwright as one of the few Black women who's present at the 1958 All African Peoples Conference in Accra, Ghana. This is a very important gathering with Kwame Nkrumah and many other prominent Black men who come together to talk about anti-colonialism, to really strategize. And this is the conference that many scholars have written about. And the way they've written about it is, well, look at all these men coming together and how they strategize, and it's a powerful moment, and it's significant for the Cold War and all of that. There's no discussion of Black women because, well, Black women aren't on the program. What they miss is that, well, they weren't on the program, but they were present. And so in the case of Marguerite Cartwright, she's physically there, she's walking around, she's listening, she's asking questions, she's interviewing people, and she gathers all of this information and she goes back and she writes a series of columns for the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, for New York Amsterdam News. And what she essentially does, I talk about her as both an observer, but as a producer of knowledge. She ultimately inserts her voice into this larger dialogue of decolonization, and she does so through her writings in the newspapers, which is to say that she doesn't have a seat at the table, yet she inserts her voice and she's able to shape the narrative using the mediums that she has access to. And she builds these personal relationships that she's able to later leverage for a number of initiatives. So she ends up getting to know Kwame Nkrumah very well, as an example. When I start looking into Marguerite Cartwright, I find her at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. And I'm like, wait, Black women were there? Yes, she was there. So you see about the invisibility of it all. It's so easy to miss, yet here she is in Indonesia, meeting people, taking notes, and then I find a trove of her writings for the Black press, for a Black American audience, in which she's talking about the significance of Bandung. So it is truly a remarkable story when you pay attention to people who would otherwise never receive any kind of limelight, because when we approach these topics in this typical kind of traditional sense, you pay attention to who's on the program, who's speaking, and what do they say, and voila, then you produce a male-dominated narrative on the All African Peoples Conference. But if you took a step back and said, okay, well, who's actually not on the program, but also shaping the conversation, you see Black women. And this is so true at various junctures of the book. I talk about Aretha McKinley, who's this amazing lobbyist in DC, who's pushing for human rights, making a case that civil and human rights cannot be disconnected, cannot be disentangled, and once again, doing that at the grassroots level and being invisible in many ways, but she shows up as a significant voice in this book.
One thing, Keisha, I was struck by is these amazing marriages with these radical Black women, and in some cases, radical husbands. And I'm not just talking about Islama Robeson and Du Bois' second wife. So will you talk a little bit about that? They were able to maintain these long-term marriages with these radical, supportive, according to you, men in the book. And it struck me. I don't know whether it struck you.
Yes.
Okay, so I want you to talk about that.
Yeah, so this is interesting. I was talking about the book, I think a couple weeks ago, and someone remarked, he said, it's interesting because you talk about everybody's relationships, in this book, which I do intentionally because, we talk about, we often use the phrase, of course, in the historical context that the personal is political, but I really do believe it's important to spend time understanding the inner life of a person if you're really going to explain their political ideas. And so I've tried to do this, and so even I've mentioned Pearl Sherrod a few times, but she's just a fascinating figure. I've been intrigued with her for a while. She's someone who didn't just talk about Afro-Asian solidarity, to your point. She married an ultra-radical Japanese activist, someone so radical that he was constantly being deported. I honestly, I chuckle about this because at one point he's deported and he just pops up again when he comes back under another name. I was like, can't do that now. But you come back and then he's in trouble again. But part of it is that he was truly, I think, someone who, certainly from the perspective of the US government, was just dangerous because he was pushing strongly for African Americans to ally with Japan, and he was talking about military action. He was talking about how to take a military stance. So a lot of people feared him. He was also deeply connected to a number of leaders of the Nation of Islam, so really grappling with this notion of the Asiatic, right? The Asiatic black man that comes out of the Nation of Islam. He was very much in alliance with a number of black intellectuals, and it's through these circles that he met Pearl Sherrod. And what's interesting is, of course, when you're doing research of this nature, you don't always have the full story, so there are just parts and pieces in the archive and that I could find about the relationship. But what's clear is that it's not solely, they seem to absolutely have an interest in each other at the personal level, but they're constantly working together politically. And so at one point when he's deported back to Japan, before he returns, he has this newspaper column in Detroit, and once he is deported, Pearl Sherrod assumes ownership of the column and begins writing in his place. And even that is a fascinating exercise because part of what happens is he's expecting her to just keep writing about Afro-Asian solidarity, but then she takes the column and she does what she wants to do with it. She starts talking about women's rights, and she starts talking about all these other topics. And then I have, through the process of doing research, evidence, like he's frustrated, like, wait, hold on a minute, like you're doing a lot of things, you're talking about other things, you need to stay the course. But it is remarkable to see both this union, this personal connection that's also very much connected to the political. That it wasn't just about thinking about Afro-Asia as a concept, as an ideal, but that she believed firmly that that would also include a relationship with a Japanese intellectual. And I've spent many years doing this research. What's fascinating is I thought they actually broke up because initially I had, in earlier versions of my writing about Pearl Sherrod, I said, the relationship fizzled. And then as I was researching again, going back over everything again, I uncovered new material that they got back together like the third time. And so I said, okay, so there's something going on here. They really do like each other. And that's just one example. But you see the way in which relationships provide certainly support, but just a powerful avenue for these women. For many, obviously, there are women in the book I talk about who are single, remain single, but I do, even some of the women who I write about, I talk about one woman in particular who's working in the UN. I talk about her going through multiple marriages, which is also another layer of this to show that it isn't all, right, love and a bed of roses. Sometimes it really is messy and complicated and difficult, because some of these women are doing the kinds of political activism that's bringing unwanted attention, that's bringing surveillance, and that sometimes leads to complexities in their own marriages and relationships. So you see that. You also see women who are in the book who are quiet about their personal lives because they're not trying to reveal to the world that they're queer, right? And you see them in the book, kind of living their lives, very involved in certain movements. And you know, I talk about one woman in Harlem, just as an example, who's everyone's like, well, who's this other woman that she's with all the time? And she's not explaining, and the other woman's not explaining, you know. And it's like, well, you don't have to know the detail, but you can imagine, right? And given the context. So it is very much a book in which I'm thinking through how the relationships oftentimes compel these individuals in their political activism, and at times it doesn't always go as well, and it's not always a positive narrative. But I do think all of that is important, because I'm trying to capture these women in their full sense, not just as political activists, but as mothers too, as wives, as lovers, as friends, as people who felt pain the way we feel pain, as people who struggled, as people who doubted themselves. That's the other thing too. So Marguerite Cartwright, at one point, she writes this angry column, and I don't even know the context, but she's trying to explain to people, like, you know, she's saying essentially, you know, don't get it twisted, and I'm still doing my duty, I'm still, you know, a wife, and I'm caring for my husband, and I'm meeting my responsibilities as a professor. And I'm thinking, well, why does she have to explain all of this? But you can imagine that somebody's critiquing her in some context, and she feels the need to say, look, I'm doing it all, and I'm doing my best. And I can relate to that. I can certainly relate to that.
How are we doing? Because I can talk forever.
Yeah, we can open it up.
Oh, okay. One more thing. I wish these women were back today. That they're really very conscious of the fascist nature of the world that we're living in, and want us to be very careful about fascism and colonialism and so forth. And they just, I mean, I just was amazed by the insights, the wisdom, the activism, the everything. And so, anyway, I couldn't put the book down. So we're gonna open it up.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you want to say anything else?
No, I'm looking
Okay,
forward to the
okay.
questions. Yeah, and if y'all can just project, because they have.
Okay.
Oh, yes. I'll repeat the
And,
question.
and tell us who you are when you come up. We can't see.
Do you just raise your hand? Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. I'm Bridget, they don't pronouns. So glad you're here. Thanks for existing. You make me feel seen. So I just want to start off, both of you actually, make me feel so seen. I'm curious to hear what are some of the sources that you were able to use to create the narratives that you wove, especially if they were, I guess you could say, non-traditional, where there was like a note or a random recipe card or a snippet of a picture. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So the question is about the sources that I use in this book. As you can imagine, an array of sources. Because I'm a historian by training, I always have to think about archives. I'm certainly mindful of the limitations of archives, and so my approach is always that I utilize archives, but I don't solely rely on archives. And I try as much as possible to supplement the material that I find in the archives, oftentimes to fill gaps, but also to add complexity, to challenge certain biases that appear in the archive. That was certainly a process for this book. One of the things that became clear to me is that for many of these women, I needed to piece together their stories. So I spent a lot of time in the census records. I've been talking about Pearl Sherrod a lot tonight, and one of the reasons I've been able to talk so much about her is because I've been doing research on her for now more than 10 years. I came across her while I was writing my dissertation. And at the time, I was able to pull parts and pieces of her story. But as the years have gone by, naturally, I've been able to access more materials, so even through the census records, more materials came up that were released, digitized, that helped me place her exactly in Alabama, and then I could trace her to Virginia, to West Virginia, and I could trace her to Detroit. And so I've spent a lot of time putting the pieces together, and then of course finding her in the newspaper was gold, because now I could actually capture her voice. In fact, it's in the newspaper that I was able to find photos of her, so I have 2 photos of her. If you search her name on Google, you'll find 2 photos of her that come directly from my work. And so it really is a painstaking process. I will say the Black press truly is a remarkable source. I cannot state that enough. It is truly a remarkable source. That's exactly why I was reading Jet magazine. That's where I found Aretha McKinley, just reading through, and voila, they're talking about Aretha McKinley, this Black woman who's interested in human rights, and she leads, this campaign. And I thought, who are you talking about? And I started looking some more and digging. And I will say, I think in the process of doing all this research, I finally connected with Aretha McKinley's daughter, and that's amazing. So I'm really hoping that this will also open up an avenue to write more about Aretha McKinley and be able to add more to this narrative, because naturally her daughter has a lot of insights that I just, I wasn't able to find in the Black press or in the census records. There's many things that I shared that she had not known. So it's really wonderful at times when you can connect with relatives to that point. For the last chapter of the book, I rely heavily on oral histories. Why? Because I wanted to demonstrate what Black women's human rights activism looks like in the contemporary. And thankfully, Kadi Diallo, who's the mother of Amadou Diallo, agreed to talk to me. And so I relied on interviews with her, as well as what I could find in archives and newspapers, to be able to center her voice and her story. And so just pulling parts and pieces together, I will say too, to give credit to really a robust body of scholarship, including Professor Beverly Guy-Sheftall's work. I was telling her earlier that I've assigned Words of Fire over and over again, and in that book, in that collection, you find Mariah Stewart, who I talk about in Without Fear. You'll find Ida B. Wells. You'll find all of these remarkable Black women. And so pulling from these women's writings and their speeches, and just trying as much as possible to connect the dots, I was able to put this together. And I will admit, I had to leave a lot of things out, which is both good and frustrating, knowing that I had a word limit and I needed to be mindful of the expectations in my agreement with my publisher. But quite frankly, I feel like I could have written 1,000 pages and it would still not be done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you had an opportunity to interview one of the women from your book, like what's the question you might want to ask somebody?
Oh, that's great.
Oh, actually, I'm actually not.
Thank you. So the question is, if I had a chance to interview the women, any of the women from the book, what question would I ask? Wow. Oh, that's a tough one. It's a great question. One of the benefits, of course, of being a historian is you don't often talk to your subjects, which I think is a benefit at times, because I would not want to have to hear what people think about the way I presented in the text. But I will say, I would love to interview Marguerite Cartwright. And one of the things about her, as I've been writing about her, thinking about her, I have a lot of information about her politics, and that's clear. But she, I think she held a lot of things close to the chest. I think, not surprisingly, perhaps just given the time period, but also the dynamics of the period. there are certain gaps, and I just would love to ask her more about what motivated her to do what she did, what compelled her to dedicate her life to this work, especially knowing, I mentioned earlier the invisibility. You know, I think so many of us, I think we can be guilty of this sometimes, do important work and we get very frustrated when people don't acknowledge the work, when people don't honor the work, award the work. You know, I'm in a field, of course, as an academic where awards matter. I'm grateful for the awards I've received. I recognize the significance of them. But I always warn people, don't get caught up in this. Don't get caught up in it, because you don't always get the accolades. And oftentimes, you will also be ignored, especially when you're doing this kind of work. And I think for someone like Marguerite Cartwright, to keep doing it, even when people aren't saying thank you or great job, and people are not even acknowledging you, sometimes taking credit for things that you did. What motivated her? I would love to hear her thoughts on that. I think that would certainly add a layer of understanding to her life, and I think there's a lot we could learn from her answer. So I wish I could ask her that. Thank you.
Yeah, we got time for one more question.
I'm Lamont. Thank you for being here. Are there names or figures that you wish you could have included in the book? I'm sure they're just maybe because of a time crunch, or maybe.
Yes. So the question is about names or figures that I wish I included in the book. So one surprising fact about this book is that I don't talk about that in the humor. And that was a tough decision. I ultimately did so for a number of reasons. One, I had already written a book on her, and I felt like, okay, I've spent time with her. I believe I've done her justice in this book. But that was frustrating because I knew that this would just be a perfect connection here. I also, it's a small thing, it's a petty thing, but you know, the Academy can be petty. I knew that if I included her, people would say, oh, she's just recycling information. And I'm like, you know, I shouldn't care, but okay, fine, I won't give them an excuse. But no, I think at the ultimate level, I thought, okay, I already covered her in this other book. Let me give space to others who haven't had the chance to have their stories told and their voices centered in the narrative. But I do think that she should have been and would have fit so beautifully in this book. Another person is Ella Baker, right? A decision I also made because I know that there's so much amazing work on Ella Baker already published. Of course, I'm thinking now of, oh yes, Barbara Ransby's book on Ella Baker, just quite frankly, the best, you know, an excellent biography. And so I knew that I could mention Ella Baker in passing and cite Barbara Ransby's work, but not have to necessarily talk about Ella Baker in depth. Another person is Pauline Murray. That was also a tough decision. I do mention Pauline Murray in brief, but don't spend as much time as I would have liked to, which was a calculated decision because I knew there were so many great books recently published too on Pauline Murray, and so I cited those books as a way to point readers in the right direction. So I think when you're doing these kinds of projects, there is a lot that goes into making these decisions, and for me it was about a balance between people who others knew about, but I could offer them, I could present them in a new light, as well as people who no one has heard of, so I could tell their stories for the first time, and do all of that somehow in a seamless narrative that's connected in some way. So it was a tough decision, but those are just a few that I certainly could have included.